But these tablets from Tărtăria, they're older, way older. Radiocarbon dating places them around 5300 BC. That's nearly 2,000 years before the Sumerians. Let that sink in. If these little clay pieces are really a form of writing, then the entire timeline of civilization is wrong. It would mean that Europe, not Mesopotamia, might have been the birthplace of writing. And that's why these tablets became such a big deal. Suddenly, the academic world was split in two. On one side, you had scholars saying, "This changes everything. We've found the world's first script." And on the other, you had skeptics arguing, "Relax, they're just religious symbols, decorations, or maybe a lucky charm." But the plot thickens. These symbols weren't a one-off discovery. Across the Danube Valley, in Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania, archaeologists have found hundreds of other artifacts with the same kinds of markings. Pottery, figurines, and tools, all bearing the same strange patterns. This wasn't random doodling, it looked like a system. Today, we call these the Vinča symbols, named after a major Neolithic site where many were found. But the big question remains, what were they for? Let's go back to that woman in the grave. Her burial wasn't casual. She was laid to rest with care, surrounded by valuable and symbolic objects. This suggests she was more than just an ordinary villager. Could she have been a priestess, a shaman, a keeper of ancient knowledge? In a time when writing or even proto-writing was just beginning, it's likely only a select few could understand and use it. Maybe she was one of those people. Maybe those tablets held secrets that only she knew, and when she died they were buried with her, like taking a diary to the grave. The stakes here are enormous. If the Vinča symbols are true writing, it means our story of civilization isn't a straight line that starts in Mesopotamia. It's more like a messy, tangled web with different cultures all over the world innovating and experimenting, some of which were completely forgotten by history. It would mean that an advanced Neolithic culture existed in Europe, building large settlements, working with copper, and, just maybe, writing things down 2,000 years before the Sumerians. And then somehow they vanished from memory, erased from the historical record until a shovel hit the dirt in 1961. So, when you look at those Tărtăria tablets, you're not just looking at cracked clay. You're staring at a possibility that could rewrite the first chapter of human history. You're seeing evidence that the people of old Europe might have been far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. Not just farmers, but storytellers and record keepers, trying to capture their world in symbols. And here's the most tantalizing part. To this day, no one has cracked the code. We still don't know for sure if the Vinča symbols represent a true language or something else entirely. The mystery of whether it's the world's first writing or the world's most elaborate set of sacred signs is what makes this story so captivating. So here we are, left with a 7,000-year-old puzzle, a grave in Transylvania, a mysterious woman, and 3 clay tablets covered in markings that shouldn't exist. If they are writing, they are the origin point. If they're not, they're still one of the most profound symbolic systems humanity has ever created. Either way, they stand as a direct challenge to everything we think we know about our own past. And this mystery, it's far from solved. In fact, it's just getting started. To 4000 BC. That's thousands of years before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before Mesopotamia was even a thing. And they weren't just scraping by with sticks and caves. They were building some of the largest and most complex settlements of their time. Imagine this. Little towns popping up all across the Danube River Valley, in what's now Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and beyond. And we're not talking tiny huts either. Archaeologists have found settlements with thousands of people, organized streets, and even what looked like early versions of temples and shrines. These weren't just clusters of farmers. They were communities buzzing with life. And get this, they were seriously good at pottery. I know pottery doesn't sound thrilling at first, but wait until you see it. Their ceramics were polished, decorated with intricate designs, and painted in bright reds, blacks, and whites. Some even had those mysterious symbols carved right into them. This wasn't just kitchenware. It was art. It was culture. It was identity. And that's not all. These people were among the first in the world to work with copper and gold. Yeah, while other groups were still figuring out how to sharpen stones, old Europe was hammering out shiny jewelry and tools. In fact, The oldest known gold treasure in the world comes from the Varna necropolis in Bulgaria, dated to around 4500 BC. That's old Europe. So let's stop and think about this for a second. We usually imagine civilization starting in Mesopotamia or Egypt, right? But here we have this Neolithic European culture with big settlements, advanced metallurgy, elaborate art, and maybe even writing, thousands of years beforehand. Sounds like civilization to me. But here's the twist. For most of modern history, hardly anyone knew about old Europe. Why? Because it basically vanished without leaving behind the giant monuments we're used to. No pyramids, no ziggurats, no massive stone temples to brag about. What they left was more subtle. Figurines, decorated pottery, and yes, those puzzling symbols. And honestly, that's part of the reason they got overlooked. Archaeologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries were obsessed with big stuff. If you didn't leave behind a colossal stone building or a king's tomb full of treasure, you weren't considered civilized. Old Europe just didn't fit that picture, so it was treated like background noise. But here's what's wild. When you look at the evidence, old Europe might have been ahead of the curve. Their settlements were some of the largest in the world at the time, places like Lepenski Vir, Vinča, and Tărtăria itself. They had social organization, religious practices, long-distance trade, and advanced craftwork. And they thrived for thousands of years. That's not some accidental backwater culture, that's a powerhouse. Let's zoom in on daily life for a second. Picture a settlement along the Danube, houses built with wooden frames and clay walls, with roofs thatched with reeds. Inside, you've got pottery stacked neatly, hearths glowing, maybe even shrines decorated with figurines. Outside, there are fields of wheat and barley, herds of cattle grazing. Kids are running around while adults grind grain, weave textiles, or shape clay. It's a peaceful, sustainable, and surprisingly advanced way of life for the time. And it wasn't just about survival. They had beliefs. They created thousands of figurines, many of them stylized female figures often decorated with those same mysterious markings. Scholars debate what they meant: fertility goddesses, ancestors, spiritual guardians. But clearly, symbolism was at the heart of their world. They weren't just farming and eating, they were building a worldview. Now, let's tie this back to our mysterious tablets. If old Europe was this complex, it suddenly doesn't seem so crazy that they might have been experimenting with symbols as a form of communication. In fact, it almost feels natural. A society that big and that rich in culture, of course they'd be tinkering with ways to record meaning. Here's the part that gets me. Old Europe existed for millennia. That's longer than the entire Roman Empire lasted. But while Rome left behind stone and Latin, old Europe faded quietly, like a whisper lost in the wind. No massive ruins to shout their achievements, just scattered artifacts, fragile pottery, and strange signs that hint at something greater. And yet, what they left is powerful enough to challenge our entire timeline of civilization. That's why those tablets hit so hard. They're not just random relics, they're puzzle pieces. And when you place them back into the bigger picture of old Europe, you start to see the outline of something extraordinary. Think about it. For centuries, we've been told civilization had one starting point. But what if that's wrong? What if there were multiple cradles of civilization, parallel experiments in how to live, how to believe, how to communicate? Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, and Europe too. Old Europe might have been one of those early experiments. A forgotten one. And here's where the humor creeps in. We, modern humans, like to think we're super advanced. We've got phones, Wi-Fi, TikTok. But imagine if you plopped one of these old Europeans into our world. They'd be like, "Oh, you've got video calls? Cute. We invented metallurgy, giant villages, and maybe writing while you guys were still chasing deer with sticks." Perspective, right? So let's give credit where it's due. Old Europe wasn't primitive. It was a civilization, one that deserves a spot at the table of history. And those tablets, those little clay mysteries, might be the closest thing we have to hearing their voice across time. So, we've uncovered the stage. Old Europe, a forgotten civilization, complex, thriving, artistic, spiritual. a place where people lived in organized settlements, worshipped with symbols, and maybe, just maybe, started writing. This means the question gets even sharper. Were those markings on the Tărtăria tablets really the first words ever written? Or were they just the sacred signs of a people who thought in symbols? To answer that, we need to look closer at the symbols themselves, and that's exactly where we're headed next. Small, maybe palm-sized, a light brown color, cracked around the edges from age. And right there on the surface are these carefully scratched designs. Some look like crosses, others look like little trees. A couple even look a bit like the letter E turned sideways, or maybe a tiny ladder. Now at first glance you might just shrug and think, okay, cool doodles. But here is the kicker. Archaeologists have cataloged hundreds of these kinds of symbols across the entire Danube region. They are not random. They repeat. They show up on pottery, on figurines, on plaques, on little fragments of clay. And while some appear all by themselves, others come in sequences, as if they were meant to be read in a certain order. Let me give you some examples. There's one symbol that looks like a stylized fish. Another looks like a comb with 4 teeth. You've got spirals, triangles, a snake-like squiggle, and a square with a cross inside of it. Some are simple geometric shapes, while others feel more symbolic, like little pictures of animals, plants, or maybe even stars and the moon. And here's the thing. The sheer variety is mind-blowing. Scholars have counted over 700 distinct symbols in the Vinča collection. That's not just a handful of doodles. That's a whole repertoire, a complete toolbox of signs. And the fact that they show up consistently across multiple sites over hundreds, even thousands of years, suggests they weren't just someone's personal sketches. They meant something. Now this is where people start to lean in and go, hold up, that sounds an awful lot like a writing system. Because think about it. Writing isn't just random marks. Writing is when you have a set of symbols, you repeat them, and you use them to communicate meaning. The Vinča symbols tick a lot of those boxes. But then comes the big question. Were they actually writing or just something we call proto-writing? See, true writing systems, like cuneiform in Mesopotamia or hieroglyphs in Egypt, don't just symbolize ideas. They connect directly to spoken language. They represent words and sounds. Proto-writing, on the other hand, is more like a halfway step. You have symbols with meaning, yes, but they aren't tied directly to the structure of language. Think of tally marks for counting sheep, or religious icons that represent big ideas like fertility, death, or the sun. And that's the great debate with the Vinča symbols. Did they capture actual speech? Or were they purely symbolic, ritualistic, maybe even decorative? Let's zoom in on those 3 famous Tărtăria tablets again. One of them has 4 neat symbols arranged in a row. A tree-like figure, a chevron shape, that little comb, and a circle with a cross inside. That arrangement, whether it's left to right or top to bottom, looks intentional. It looks like a sentence, the kind of thing you'd expect from a writing system. But when archaeologists compared it with known ancient scripts, nothing matched. There's no Rosetta Stone here, no handy translation key, just raw, fascinating mystery. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Some of the Vinča symbols bear a resemblance, and just a resemblance, mind you, to early Sumerian signs from Mesopotamia. For example, that cross in a circle motif pops up in both cultures. Same with certain zigzags and chevrons. So, naturally, some scholars started asking, was there a connection? Did Old Europe influence Mesopotamia? Or were these just coincidences, the kind of basic shapes that humans all over the world naturally come up with? Imagine the academic drama. If there was a link, it would mean ideas traveled between cultures way earlier than we thought. It would mean the so-called cradle of civilization in the Near East might have actually borrowed from an older, forgotten neighbor in Europe. That idea alone has sparked decades of heated debates, academic side-eyes, and probably a few shouting matches at historical conferences. So let's take a step back for a second. If these symbols weren't full-blown writing, what could they have been used for? Let's run through the leading theories. First, religious symbols. A lot of the objects they're found on, figurines, ritual plaques, and pieces of what look like home shrines, suggest some kind of sacred meaning. Maybe they were prayers, spells, or protective charms. You could think of them as emojis for the divine world. Second, potter's marks. Some archaeologists think the symbols might have just been workshop signatures, like a Neolithic craftsman saying, "Hey, this fancy pot was made by me, Steve." It's a way of claiming ownership or origin. Third, they could have been used for counting and trade. Others argue they were tallies, an early accounting system to track animals, grain, or goods being traded. That theory gets a lot stronger when you remember that Mesopotamian writing, the first confirmed writing system, actually started out as a way of keeping accounting records too. And of course, there's the simplest theory of all. They were just for decoration. Pretty marks to make pots and other objects look cool. But here's the catch. None of those theories really explains everything. The sheer scale of the symbols, their variety, the way they repeat, the way they're arranged in sequences, it feels like so much more than just decoration. It feels like they were trying to build a system. And that's what hooks people. Because if the Vinča symbols really were the earliest attempt at writing, then Europe, not Mesopotamia, would hold the crown for the world's first script. That's not just a small historical adjustment. That's rewriting the first chapter of civilization itself. Now let's not get carried away, harried. Plenty of experts still say no, it's not writing. The biggest problem is we just don't have enough evidence. Without a decoder, something like the Rosetta Stone that provides a translation, we can't prove the symbols represent a language. For now, they're stuck in this gray zone, not fully writing but not fully random either. And maybe that's what makes them so fascinating. They live in this limbo, teasing us with the possibility of a lost language. A secret code from people who lived 7,000 years ago. People whose names and voices are long gone, but who left us these scratches on clay as if to say, we were here. We thought things. We believed things. And we tried to capture it all before it slipped away. Let's be honest. There's something haunting and beautiful about that. Imagine holding one of those tablets. You're looking at a message that someone carved thousands of years ago, and you have absolutely no idea what it means. It could be a shopping list, a powerful prayer, or even the world's oldest dad joke. We just don't know. But that mystery, that's the magic of it. It keeps us coming back, digging deeper and asking bigger questions. So, now we've got the symbols laid out, the real stars of our show. We have hundreds of signs, repeating across centuries, possibly the first system of writing, or maybe just the first great puzzle of history. The next step? We need to dive into the tablets themselves, because the Tărtăria find wasn't just a cool discovery. It was an incredibly controversial one. Some people even questioned if those tablets were real at all. And that, my friends, is where our story takes its first dramatic twist. Tablets. Now on its own, that sounds like a cool but not exactly earth-shattering discovery. But when Vlasa cleaned the dirt off those tablets, he froze. Because there they were. Carved markings, deliberate and sharp. Not random scratches. These were symbols. And suddenly this wasn't just another prehistoric grave. This was a mystery bomb dropped right in the middle of the established timeline of civilization. Let's set the scene for just how big a deal this was. Until that moment, the earliest known writing in the world was Mesopotamian cuneiform, which emerged around 3100 BC. But these tablets from Tărtăria, initial dating placed them at over 5000 BC. That's more than 1,000 years earlier. If this was true, it meant that so-called Old Europe, this area often considered a historical backwater compared to the ancient Near East, was using sophisticated symbols long before Sumerian scribes even thought about pressing wedges into clay. You can just imagine the shockwaves that sent through the academic world. Archaeology conferences suddenly got very, very spicy. On one side, you had scholars who were absolutely thrilled. We've found it, the first writing. They were ready to rewrite the history books. On the other side, you had scholars crossing their arms and muttering, "No way, this is impossible, it's got to be a mistake." So why the huge split? Why couldn't everyone just agree? Well, to understand the debate, we need to break down the evidence, piece by piece. First, let's look at the tablets themselves. There are 3 of them and they're tiny. One tablet is round with a hole drilled through it, suggesting it might have been worn as a pendant. Another is rectangular, featuring 4 neatly arranged symbols, a tree-like sign, a chevron, a comb-like shape, and a circle with a cross inside. The third is smaller and has what looks like a stylized animal scratched onto its surface. These don't look like accidental doodles a child would make in the mud. They look like a system. They're organized. And here's a wild little detail. Two of the tablets, the round one and the rectangular one, actually seem to fit together. It's as if they were meant to be worn or displayed as a set, like a prehistoric locket, but instead of a picture of your crush, it holds a secret code. Next, we have the burial itself. The woman found with these tablets wasn't complete. Her skull was missing along with her hands and feet. Now that's creepy, right? It strongly suggests this wasn't a normal, peaceful burial. It was likely a ritual deposit, perhaps what's known as a secondary burial, where the bones are moved and reinterred sometime after death. Archaeologists speculate she could have been a ritual specialist, a priestess or a shaman, someone whose entire role in society was tied to the power and meaning of these symbols. Maybe she was even their creator, the keeper of this ancient knowledge. But this brings us to the third point, the controversy. The biggest problem with the Tărtăria discovery was the excavation itself. By modern standards, Vlasa's team wasn't exactly careful. The preservation methods they used at the time, which involved baking the tablets, actually ended up damaging them and made certain types of analysis impossible later on. And here's the most critical issue. The bones of the woman were not directly radiocarbon dated. Instead, archaeologists dated the surrounding soil layer. This left a giant, gaping hole in the evidence. Were the tablets really from 5300 BC? Or could they have been intrusive, meaning something from a much later time period that somehow slipped into an older archaeological layer? This uncertainty gave the skeptics all the ammunition they needed. Some even went so far as to accuse the entire thing of being a hoax. Fake tablets planted in an ancient grave to make a name for oneself, they claimed. That might sound extreme, but the accusation stuck around. Even today, some historians just roll their eyes whenever the Tărtăria tablets are mentioned. But here's where the story gets even juicier. Whether the original excavation was flawed or not, the Tărtăria tablets are not unique. This is the crucial part. Similar symbols, the same style, the same shapes, have now been found at dozens of other sites across the Balkans, all associated with what's called the Vinča culture. These symbols show up on pottery, on figurines, and on other ritual objects, stretching over a period of centuries. So even if you decided to toss the 3 Tărtăria tablets into the questionable bin because of the messy excavation, the larger pattern doesn't just go away. The Vinča culture was without a doubt carving hundreds of these strange, systematic marks onto their belongings. And that's why the Tărtăria discovery is so compelling. It's not just about 3 little pieces of clay. It's about being a gateway into an entire lost symbolic world. Now let's circle back to that woman they found. Some have started calling her the Lady of Tărtăria. Analysis of her bones suggests she was about 50 years old, which was quite elderly for her time. She also had some kind of physical disability, maybe a limp or a chronic illness that affected her movement, but instead of being cast aside by her community, she was buried with the highest honors. Beautiful figurines, expensive shell jewelry, and of course those mysterious tablets. Was she a respected elder, a priestess guarding secret knowledge, a shaman who used these symbols in sacred rituals? Or maybe, just maybe, the first person in human history to wear a written charm around her neck for protection or power? We don't know for sure. But the story practically writes itself. Imagine her village 7,000 years ago. People are gathered around a hearth inside a shrine. The Lady of Tărtăria sits at the center, perhaps chanting, as she carefully marks wet clay with symbols that only she and a select few understand. When she passes away, her people bury her with those same symbols, as if to ensure her wisdom and power would travel with her into the afterlife. And then, thousands of years later, a team of archaeologists stumbles upon her grave, and they are left completely baffled, sparking a debate that continues to this day. It's pretty epic when you think about it. Of course, the skeptic in you might be thinking, okay, come on, isn't this all a bit romanticized? Maybe she just liked funky jewelry. And that's a fair point. We have to be careful not to project our own ideas onto the past. But here's the thing. Those tablets weren't just tossed into the grave randomly. They were central to her burial. They were placed there deliberately. Whoever buried her thought they mattered. A lot. And in archaeology, context is everything. So whether the tablets were magical charms, clan symbols, economic records, or a true form of proto-writing, they had a profound meaning. Enough meaning to be buried with someone who was clearly very important to her community. And that's what makes the Tărtăria tablets so much more than just ancient artifacts. They're a story. A story of people trying to capture and fix ideas into physical form. A story of ritual and mystery, of symbols that reach across 7 millennia and dare us to decode them. And here's the final kicker. Even if we never crack the code, even if the tablets never fully give up their secrets, they've already done something remarkable. They've forced us to question the entire story of civilization as we know it. Because if these really were the first steps toward writing, then everything we thought we knew, that writing began in Mesopotamia, that civilization spread from east to west, gets turned completely on its head. Suddenly, prehistoric Europe wasn't just a follower, it was a pioneer. And that, my friends, is why the Tărtăria tablets aren't just some dusty old trinkets sitting in a museum drawer. They are, quite possibly, the spark that lit one of the greatest and most fascinating mysteries in all of human history. Usually divide early scripts into 2 big categories. The first is full writing. This is a system of symbols that directly represents spoken language. It means you can take what someone says, their words, their sounds, and put it into symbols that another person can read later and basically hear in their head. Think of ancient Sumerian cuneiform. A scribe could write down not just numbers or pictures, but entire sentences about laws, gossip, or poetry. Or think of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Those weren't just fancy bird drawings. They stood for sounds, words, and complex ideas. Full writing is when you can record a grocery list, a king's decree, or an epic story. The other category is proto-writing. You can think of it as writing's more basic cousin. It's not directly tied to spoken language. Instead, it's a system of symbols that represent general ideas, numbers, or rituals. A classic example is tally marks for counting sheep. 5 lines mean 5 sheep, but it doesn't represent the word 5. Or a sun symbol that always means sun, but not necessarily the spoken word for it in a specific language. Proto-writing is powerful and useful, but it can't capture the complex flow of speech. So the million-dollar question is, which one of these are the Vinča symbols? Are they the world's oldest writing or just a sophisticated system of meaningful marks? To really get this, let's take a lightning tour of the world's earliest, confirmed writing systems. First up, Mesopotamian cuneiform. Around 3100 BC, scribes in Sumer started pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. At first, it was mostly for bookkeeping. This farmer delivered 10 jars of beer. Very important stuff, obviously. But soon, it evolved to record literature, epic tales, laws, and prayers. That's undeniably full writing. Around the same time in Egypt, hieroglyphs appeared. Yes, they look like cute animals and objects, but they were incredibly versatile. A symbol could represent a sound, a whole word, or even a conceptual category. That flexibility is what made them a complete writing system. Let's jump forward to about 1200 BC in China. Priests carved questions for the gods onto turtle shells and animal bones, then heated them until they cracked to read the answers. These ancient oracle bone scripts are the direct ancestors of the Chinese characters still used today. That's an epic survival record, and definitely full writing. And in Central America, around 300 BC, the Maya developed a stunningly complex script that mixed symbols for whole words with symbols for syllables. They used it to record their history, their astronomy, and, let's be real, a lot of royal bragging. Do you see the pattern here? All these systems don't just mark down ideas. They capture speech. You can write a complete, complex story with them. That is the gold standard for what we call true writing. Now let's go back to the Vinča symbols. They predate all of these systems by thousands of years. The oldest ones might date back to 5300 BC. If they are writing, this completely rewrites history. It would mean the first written language emerged in Europe, not Mesopotamia. That's why people get so excited, but do they meet the standard? Well, that's where things get messy. On one hand, the Vinča symbols are too consistent, too widespread, and too repetitive to be random doodles. There's clearly a structure. Some symbols often appear in groups or in specific sequences. That feels systematic, right? It feels intentional. But on the other hand, we don't find long texts. We don't see stories or laws scratched into clay tablets. We mostly find short clusters, 2 or 3 signs, maybe 4 at most, usually on a single pot or figurine. If this is a writing system, it's a very early, very primitive one. Or maybe it's not writing at all. Maybe it's a highly developed system of proto-writing. The symbols could have held sacred meanings like fertility, death, the sun, or the river, but weren't tied to specific words or sounds. They could have been ritual markers, clan identifiers, or ownership marks. But here's where we can move beyond the strict definitions and get a little poetic. I want you to imagine something. You're a Vinča artisan thousands of years ago sitting by the fire carving a small clay plaque. You scratch a symbol into it. A circle with a cross, a ladder shape, maybe something that looks like a fish. You don't know you're inventing writing. You're just trying to pin down an idea, something slippery and powerful before it drifts away. That moment, right there, might be humanity's very first attempt to capture thought in symbols. The first time we looked at the chaos of life, birth, death, trade, the stars above, and said, let's mark this down so it lasts. Whether or not it technically counts as writing, in the strict academic sense, almost feels beside the point, doesn't it? It's the spirit of writing. It's that fundamental human urge to preserve, the belief that marks in clay could hold meaning and carry it across time. And honestly, isn't that what all writing is in the end? From the first tally marks to Shakespeare's sonnets to the emoji you just sent in your group chat, it is all just humans, desperately trying to leave little pieces of their thoughts behind for others to find. So, where do the experts land on all this? The mainstream scholarly consensus is that the Vinča symbols represent a highly advanced form of proto-writing. Important, symbolic, probably used in rituals, but not a system for recording full language. Without longer texts, or a Rosetta Stone to help us decode them, it's impossible to prove otherwise. But the debate still rages on. Some researchers argue that we should broaden our very definition of writing, and that Vinča deserves the title of the first. Others guard the traditional definition fiercely, pointing to Mesopotamia as the true, undisputed origin. And maybe that tension is the real story here. It's not just about symbols on clay. It's about how we, as modern humans, define one of our most important inventions. Do we only give the crown to Mesopotamia because we can actually read their words, while the Vinča people remain silent to us? Or do we give credit to those silent scratches for being the first spark, even if that spark never grew into a roaring fire? The Vinča people may never have written epic poems or detailed tax records, but maybe, just maybe, they were the first to dream that a symbol could outlast a voice. And if that's true, then these mysterious little scratches are more than just marks in clay. They are the ancestors of every single word that has ever been written since. Secret code for ancient rituals? Or maybe just Neolithic graffiti? The truth is, nobody knows for sure, and the debate is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in archaeology. Today we're diving deep into the world of the Vinča symbols to explore what these ancient marks could really mean. Let's start with the most exciting, and let's be honest, the most romantic theory, that this was the earliest form of writing. In the mid-20th century, a brilliant and controversial archaeologist named Maria Gimbutas introduced the world to her idea of Old Europe. She pictured a peaceful, goddess-worshipping, matriarchal civilization that thrived in the Balkans long before horse-riding warriors swept in from the east. In her view, the Vinča symbols were the script of this lost civilization. Not just decorative squiggles, but a true system for recording language. This theory was huge. It gave Europe its very own first writing moment, completely independent of the Middle East. It painted a picture of ancient villages, centered around powerful female figures, carving down their wisdom thousands of years before anyone else. It's an epic story, right? But there's a catch. A big one. True writing needs to represent spoken language. We need to see sentences, long texts, records. And with the Vinča symbols, we just don't have that. The inscriptions are almost always very short, just a handful of symbols on a single object. Without a long text or something like a Rosetta Stone to help us translate, most scholars are skeptical. They prefer to call it proto-writing, a crucial first step, a spark of an idea, but not the full roaring fire of a written language. So, if it's not writing, what else could it be? This brings us to theory number 2, ritual symbols. Think about where we find these marks. They aren't on boring, everyday items. They're on figurines that look like deities or ancestors, on strange objects found in the ruins of what might be temples, and on special ceramic vessels. This isn't the kind of stuff you'd use for your grocery list and the symbols themselves. We see spirals, zigzags, crosses, and stylized animal shapes. These motifs are universal in ancient art, often linked to concepts of nature, fertility, and the cycle of life and death. So, maybe the Vinča symbols weren't meant to be read like a book. Maybe they were a sacred shorthand, a set of icons for religious ideas. A spiral could represent the endless cycle of rebirth. A snake-like line could symbolize transformation or healing. A comb-like pattern might mean rain or water. In this view, the symbols were more like a religious code than an alphabet. The people using them would have known that a certain combination of marks on a figurine invoked a specific blessing or protected a home. This theory fits the archaeological context beautifully. The main criticism? It's a bit vague. A spiral can mean a dozen different things to different cultures. Without a clear key, are we really decoding their beliefs, or are we just projecting our own modern ideas onto their ancient clay? All right, let's get a bit more practical. Theory number 3. These are potter's marks. Imagine you're a skilled potter back in 5000 BC. You've just crafted a batch of beautiful, high-quality bowls. You're proud of your work. You want everyone in the village, and maybe the next village over, to know that these top-tier pots came from your workshop. What do? You scratch your personal mark onto the bottom of each one. Boom. Neolithic branding. Some archaeologists think this is the most straightforward explanation. Many of the symbols are found on pottery, and marking your creations is a practice as old as craftsmanship itself. It explains why a single symbol might appear on multiple pots in one location. The problem? There are hundreds and hundreds of different Vinča symbols. That's a lot of potters. More importantly, the symbols are often found in strings or groups of 2, 3, or more. That seems overly complicated for a simple made by Steve mark. Unless, of course, Neolithic Steve had a very, very elaborate signature. So, while it's a neat practical idea, it doesn't quite explain the complexity we see. Now, let's stick with practicality and look at theory number 4, tallies and accounting. We know for a fact that writing in Mesopotamia began as a way to keep records. It wasn't poetry or history, it was accounting. Farmers and temple administrators needed to track sheep, jars of oil, and bushels of grain. So they developed symbols to represent goods and numbers. Over centuries, this system evolved into a full-blown script. Could the Vinča symbols be an early stage of the same process? Maybe a sequence of 4 lines meant 4 goats. Perhaps a fish-like symbol on a tablet was a receipt for a catch of fish. A circle could represent one completed trade. This theory has a lot going for it because it aligns with what we know about the origins of writing elsewhere. The downside? Again, the symbols themselves. Many Vinča signs are highly abstract and complex. They don't look like simple pictures of goats or grain, and we don't find the long, organized lists you'd expect from an accounting system. Instead, we have these isolated, enigmatic plaques with just a few symbols. So while the idea makes sense, the evidence on the ground doesn't quite fit. Then we have the simplest, most buzz-killing theory of all. They were just decorations. People have always liked making their stuff look nice. From the day we first figured out how to make a pot, we've been decorating them with patterns. Maybe the Vinča people just enjoyed scratching spirals, chevrons, and crosses onto their pottery because it looked cool. Simple as that. The biggest argument against this is the sheer consistency. The same distinct symbols appear again and again, across different sites separated by hundreds of miles and across centuries of time. If it were just random decoration, you'd expect much more variety. It would be like everyone in Europe spontaneously deciding to doodle the exact same 50 patterns for 1,000 years. It's not impossible, but it's pretty unlikely. This level of standardization suggests the symbols meant something specific. And now, for my personal favorite category, the wild stuff, the pseudo-scholarship. Spend 5 minutes searching for Vinča script online, and you'll fall down a rabbit hole of fantastic claims. You'll find people who insist the script has been decoded, and that it proves the existence of Atlantis. Others will tell you it's a star map left behind by ancient aliens. One particularly popular fringe theory in the Balkans claims the symbols are an early form of Slavic language, proving their culture is the oldest in Europe by thousands of years. These theories are definitely entertaining, but they all share one thing in common: a complete lack of evidence. They rely on forcing modern languages onto ancient symbols, making huge logical leaps, and ignoring all the archaeological context. They're built on imagination, not on science. But their popularity highlights just how powerful this mystery is. It's a blank slate, a 7,000-year-old puzzle so vast that people can project almost anything they want onto it. So why does each of the mainstream theories stick around? Because each one has a piece of the puzzle. The Proto-Writing theory feels revolutionary. It's Europe's claim to a monumental invention. The ritual symbol theory connects perfectly with the sacred-looking artifacts. The potter's mark and accounting theories are practical and grounded in human behavior. But every single one has a flaw, a piece of evidence that just doesn't fit. And until someone finds a Vinča Rosetta Stone, a bilingual text that can unlock the meaning, the debate will continue to circle. But maybe, at the end of the day, solving the puzzle isn't the most important thing. Maybe the real magic is in the mystery itself. These symbols are the echoes of people trying for the first time to make their thoughts permanent, to take an idea out of their head and press it into clay, hoping it would last, whether it was a prayer to a goddess, a record of a trade, a mark of ownership, or simply a beautiful design. They felt an urge to leave a mark. Thousands of years later, those marks have survived. We may never know their exact language, but in their ambition, we can see a reflection of ourselves. Every mark in the clay is a human voice, stretched across time. The Vinča people may not have invented writing as we know it, but they dreamed in symbols. And those dreams are still speaking to us today, even if we don't yet understand the words. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into old Europe. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, discovered across sites in Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and beyond. Now, these aren't realistic statues. They're stylized, abstract. Many have exaggerated features, broad hips, tiny heads, and sloping shoulders. They seem to be less about capturing a person's likeness and more about representing an idea. Most scholars see them as icons of fertility, representing the great cycles of life, perhaps even portraying goddesses or ancestral spirits. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. They're often decorated, scratched with the very same symbols we find on mysterious tablets from the same culture. We see intricate patterns of triangles, lozenges, spirals, snakes, and zigzags. This tells us these weren't just decorative objects or simple toys. These were charged objects. Each figurine was a miniature universe, holding layers of powerful messages. A woman-shaped figurine marked with a lozenge wasn't just art. It might have been a prayer for a good harvest, a charm for renewal, or even a teaching tool for sacred rituals. Let's try to decode some of these recurring motifs. Snakes, for example, slither all over Vinča artifacts. In many ancient cultures, the snake is a powerful symbol of transformation. They shed their skin, seemingly dying and coming back to life. They represent life, death, and rebirth, all in one elegant, powerful form. For the people of old Europe, the snake was a perfect metaphor for the cycles of nature and existence. Then we have triangles and lozenges. These shapes show up constantly, often placed on the belly or hips of the figurines. They're almost universally linked to fertility, the female body, and the miracle of creation. You can think of them as a kind of Neolithic shorthand for the source of all life. And what about those hypnotic curves? Spirals are another dominant symbol, and they represent cycles. the journey of the sun across the sky, the changing of the seasons, the eternal, never-ending loop of birth, death, and rebirth. To our modern eyes, they might just look like pretty designs, but to the people who carved them, spirals might have been the very blueprint of existence itself. We also see crosses inside circles, a symbol still powerful today, representing the sun, the four cardinal directions, and cosmic balance. It's easy to look at these marks and dismiss them as mere ornament. But in old Europe, they were so much more than decoration. They were a language of the sacred. So what kind of worldview does all of this add up to? Imagine a society where the line between the material and the spiritual world is incredibly thin, almost non-existent. A world where the earth is a living, breathing being, the sky is alive, and every animal and plant is part of a sacred, interconnected cycle. In this world, fertility isn't just about having babies. It's about the fertility of the crops, the return of the seasons, the very survival of the community. And death isn't a final end. It's just a transformation, a form of rebirth, a return to the great cosmic whole. In a world like that, scratching a spiral into a piece of wet clay wasn't just art. It was an act of power. It was a way to anchor cosmic truths into a physical object. A way to carry the sacred with you, in your home, in your rituals, and even to accompany you in your burial. Some archaeologists argue that old Europe was less concerned with kings and warriors, and more focused on rituals, shrines, and a shared symbolic culture. The villages they left behind didn't give us great fortresses or armories filled with weapons. They left us shrines, countless figurines, and beautifully decorated pottery, objects saturated with meaning. This suggests they may have been a society organized around spiritual beliefs and rituals rather than politics and warfare. Their power wasn't in armies but in ideas. And here's why this matters so deeply. Think about how we, as humans, make sense of the world. We use stories, we use metaphors, we use symbols. The Vinča people were no different. When they carved a snake onto a figurine, they weren't just drawing an animal. They were making a profound statement. We live in a universe of constant transformation. When they pressed triangles into the clay, they weren't just doodling. They were whispering a sacred truth. Life comes from the womb, from the earth itself. And when they carved spirals, they were declaring, time is not a straight line. It is a cycle. We live, we die, and we return. In short, they didn't just decorate their world. They encoded it with their deepest beliefs. Let's try to put a human face on this. Picture a woman from a Vinča village, 7,000 years ago, sitting by a warm hearth, shaping a piece of clay into a figurine. With focused intention, she presses a spiral into its chest. To her, this isn't just craftwork. It's a prayer. It's an act of protection, a reminder of the eternal cycles that govern her life. Perhaps she hands it to her daughter, who places it reverently in a small household shrine. Later, when the crops are failing and fear begins to creep in, the family gathers around that shrine. They light a fire, its flickering light dancing on the clay figure, and place it in the center of their circle. They chant, they hope, they believe. That's the kind of universe they lived in, a place where symbols weren't abstract concepts. They were alive and powerfully real. Fast forward 7,000 years and we still live in a world saturated with symbols. Think about corporate logos, emojis, and national flags, tiny images loaded with huge amounts of meaning. The Vinča people may not have had alphabets as we know them, but they understood the same fundamental human truth that we do. Symbols can move us, unite us, comfort us, and carry our deepest ideas across time and space. And maybe that's the real, timeless connection. Their spirals and snakes are, in a way, our emojis and hashtags. The medium is different, but the human impulse is exactly the same, to take the vast, chaotic, and often overwhelming universe and shrink it into something we can hold, carve, wear, and share. Closing scene. The people of old Europe lived in a universe that was alive with symbols. To them, every line was a prayer, every curve a cycle, every mark a bridge between the worlds of life and death. They may be long gone, but their symbols still speak to us today, reminding us that long before we had written words, humanity dreamed in signs. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. Croplands dried up in some areas and were drowned in others. For farmers who depended on fertile soil, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was devastating. Fewer crops meant hunger, tension, and migration. Then there's the unsettling possibility of disease. Ancient skeletons from this period show strange lesions and patterns that hint at a plague or a widespread epidemic. If this is true, sickness could have swept through their dense villages, leaving fear and abandonment in its wake. Imagine entire communities fleeing not from an enemy they could see, but from an invisible killer. And then we come to the most dramatic theory of all: invasions. Far to the northeast, across the vast Eurasian steppes, lived mobile, horse-riding herders, the Proto-Indo-European cultures. By around 4000 BC, they began pushing westward, driven by their own needs and ambitions. They carried new technologies, new gods, and perhaps most importantly, new weapons. These were warrior societies. Where old Europe had built villages without fortifications, the steppe peoples built cultures centered on conquest and expansion. Imagine that collision. On one side you have old Europe with its intricate shrines, its mysterious figurines, its beautifully painted pottery, and its enigmatic symbols. On the other, aggressive newcomers arrive with powerful battle axes, the advantage of domesticated horses, and a patriarchal, warrior-based worldview. The result was catastrophic. Old Europe's towns burned, its populations fled. Some communities may have adapted and merged with the newcomers, but many others simply disappeared from the historical record entirely. And this is the tragedy of it all. Old Europe had developed metallurgy long before Mesopotamia. They were making sophisticated copper tools, ornaments, and mastering smelting techniques when others were still deep in the Stone Age. They had advanced art, shrines filled with figurines that puzzle us to this day. And possibly, just possibly, they were taking the earliest steps toward writing. And yet, by 3300 BC, so much of it was gone. The villages were abandoned. Traditions that had endured for millennia were shattered. The symbols they carved were forgotten. The people who once lived in a world seemingly governed by cycles and symbols had been overtaken by a new world that valued conquest over connection. It wasn't an instant collapse, but more like a slow, painful fading, a light dimming over 1,000 years. By the time Mesopotamia's great cities were rising in the south, the memory of old Europe was already being buried under layers of earth and time. And this brings us to a dramatic contrast. While old Europe declined, Mesopotamia surged. By 3100 BC, the Sumerians had massive cities, towering ziggurats and fully developed writing systems carved into clay tablets. They recorded their laws, their myths, their trade records, and their poetry. They told us who they were. Meanwhile, the Vinča symbols were forgotten. No one remembered what they meant. The little clay tablets they were etched on sat buried in graves, silent for millennia. And so history went one way instead of another. Mesopotamia became known as the cradle of civilization. Old Europe became a ghost. This leads us to the emotional heart of this story. What if? What if old Europe had survived? What if their symbolic system had been allowed to develop into a true writing system, potentially thousands of years before Sumer? What if their worldview, a world alive with cycles, fertility, and transformation, had shaped the foundation of Western civilization instead of being erased? Would our myths, our religions, even our societies look different today? We'll never know. And that's the haunting beauty of this lost chapter of human history. A civilization that was incredibly advanced in its art, its technology, and perhaps its philosophy, collapsed before it could leave us its full voice. And yet, maybe it's not completely lost. Those symbols carved into clay, those strange figurines etched with spirals and snakes, those shrines, that pottery, those copper tools, they are whispers from a forgotten world. Today, archaeologists, artists, and dreamers still puzzle over them, trying to hear what they are saying. The Vinča symbols may never be fully decoded, but they remind us that history is not a straight line. Civilization didn't only spring from Mesopotamia or Egypt. There were other worlds, other peoples, experimenting, dreaming, and carving their visions into clay, long before the so-called winners wrote the history books. Old Europe collapsed, but its symbols remain, tiny deliberate marks on fragile pieces of clay. They are proof that even in the dawn of humanity, we were already trying to capture the mysteries of life, death, and meaning. Their civilization may have vanished, but their question still lingers. How early did we humans begin to write our souls into the world? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. Wool markings, or maybe just ancient doodles we've mistaken for something more profound. On one side, you have the strict scholars. For them, the definition is clear. Writing must record spoken language. If the Vinča signs don't do that, they don't count. Case closed. It's a clean, simple, but perhaps rigid perspective. On the other side are the visionaries, inspired by the work of archaeologist Maria Gimbutas and her Old Europe theory. They see something more. To them, the symbols weren't just squiggles, they were part of a sophisticated symbolic system. Maybe not writing in the Mesopotamian sense, but something more spiritual, more connected to the rhythms of the world. A visual language used to map the cycles of life, fertility, and transformation. A way of thinking, not just a way of speaking. And then, of course, you have the enthusiasts, those who let their imaginations run wild. They'll tell you the Vinča people were a lost, advanced civilization with secret knowledge, perhaps even connected to the legendary Atlantis. Now, mainstream scholars usually roll their eyes at these theories, and for good reason. But the fact that these little marks can inspire such grand tales shows just how magnetic, how powerful their mystery truly is. Before these tablets were discovered, our story of the past was neat and tidy. The textbooks were clear. Writing began in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE. Cities began there. Civilization, as we knew it, was born there. Full stop. It was a linear, straightforward narrative. But the Vinča symbols, dated to as early as 5300 BCE, cracked that story wide open. Suddenly the timeline was in chaos. If these were a form of writing, it would mean that people in southeastern Europe were writing a full millennium before the Sumerians. The neat and tidy story was gone. This didn't just complicate the story of human history, it made it so much richer. It suggested that maybe Mesopotamia wasn't the one and only cradle of civilization. Maybe human ingenuity and creativity were bubbling up in different corners of the world, all at the same time, in different ways. Maybe the first people to carve their thoughts into clay weren't tea kings and scribes in a bustling city, but farmers and villagers living along the Danube River. History stopped being a straight road and started looking more like a tangled ancient forest, with countless trails, countless experiments, and countless forgotten voices. And that brings us to the very heart of the debate. Who gets to define what counts as civilization? Is it about a centralized state, armies, and writing down laws on clay tablets? If so, then Mesopotamia clearly wins the prize. But what if the definition is broader? What if it's about sophisticated art, spiritual shrines, advanced metallurgy, and a shared system of symbols that connected an entire culture? If that's the measure, then Old Europe was there first. Or maybe, just maybe, civilization is simply humans organizing their lives in complex and meaningful ways. If that's the case, then perhaps we need to stop keeping score altogether. The Vinča symbols challenge us to rethink our neat categories. They tell us that civilization didn't begin in one place, with one people, at one specific time. It began in many places, in many forms. Some of those forms left deep, lasting marks, while others were buried, forgotten, and are only now whispering back to us from the earth. So here's the big takeaway from this ancient mystery. Human history is not a straight line. It's not a simple march of progress from primitive to advanced. It's a messy, beautiful patchwork, a complex web, a grand story full of bold experiments, some of which led to the world we know today, and others that were lost to time. The people of the Vinča culture may not have given us an alphabet or epic poems, but they gave us something else, something arguably more profound. A powerful reminder that the human drive to symbolize, to communicate, to capture meaning in marks and signs, is incredibly ancient. It's older than Mesopotamia. It's older than the pyramids of Egypt. It's as old as humanity itself. Their spirals, their triangles, their strange comb-like figures may never be translated in the way we translate hieroglyphs. But they still speak. They whisper to us across 7,000 years. We were here. We dreamed. We believed. We carved our souls into clay. And perhaps that's why this mystery resonates so deeply with us today. Because when you think about it, we're still doing the very same thing. We just use different tools. We etch our ideas onto digital tablets instead of clay ones. We communicate with emojis, hashtags, flags, and corporate logos. We use tiny symbols packed with layers of meaning, quick, simple signs that carry entire worlds of context and emotion. The Vinča people remind us, this is not new, this is who we are, and perhaps the greatest legacy of their symbols is not whether they were true writing or not. Their true legacy is the revelation of a timeless truth. Humans everywhere, in every age, have felt the deep, unshakable need to leave a mark. A trace of themselves, a sign to the future that says we existed, a way to be remembered. The Vinča symbols may never give up their secrets entirely, but maybe they don't need to, because in the end, the mystery itself is the gift. They remind us that our shared history is bigger, stranger, and far more beautiful than the simple stories we tell about it, and that long before the first kings of Mesopotamia built their empires, there were other people with other voices, carving their truth into the world, and hoping that someone, someday, would be there to listen. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. But it's a symbolic system, closer to tallies, pictograms, or even ritual codes. It's something that could have grown into full writing if history had taken a different turn. And then there's the ritual school of thought. This is the belief that these were sacred marks, deeply tied to fertility, the cycles of nature, life, and death. They weren't meant to be read, like a sentence, but to be experienced as part of a ritual, a memory, a myth. So what were they? Art, code, ritual, or all three at once? The simple, frustrating truth is, we don't know. And maybe, we never will. And here lies the frustrating beauty of archaeology. Some mysteries just stay mysteries. Unless someone somewhere digs up a Rosetta Stone for the Vinča culture, a bilingual inscription that could translate these symbols, we'll always be stuck right here on the edge of knowing. It's entirely possible these signs are just too minimal to ever decode. It's also possible they were never meant to be read as writing in the first place. But that very uncertainty is also what keeps this story alive. Every new discovery, every single fragment of clay, carries with it the hope that someday the silence will finally break, that the Vinča will finally speak to us across the millennia. This brings us to a truly haunting question. What if Europe had developed writing 2,000 years earlier? Just imagine it for a moment. By 5300 BC, instead of Mesopotamia being the first record keepers, it was the farmers of old Europe. Imagine their myths, their rituals, their entire cosmology written down, passed from village to village and preserved for thousands of years. Would the story of civilization be different? Absolutely. Would Europe, not Mesopotamia, be remembered as the first cradle of writing? Would our religions, our languages, even our sense of history itself have been completely reshaped? It's impossible to know, of course, but it's a powerful reminder that history isn't inevitable. It's not a straight line. It could have gone differently, and maybe, just maybe, it almost did. But here's the thing. Even if the symbols remain undeciphered forever, they still matter. They remind us that the urge to communicate through marks on a surface, the fundamental urge to capture thought, ritual, and meaning, is far older than we once believed. The Vinča people may not have invented writing as we strictly define it, but they were dreaming in symbols long before kings and empires ever came along. And in a way, that's enough. The Vinča symbols remain silent. But in their silence, they whisper of a forgotten world. A world that might have been the true birthplace of the written word. So what do you think? Were these the first steps toward writing or simply the sacred marks of a lost faith? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take on this. And if you enjoyed exploring this ancient mystery with me, make sure to hit that like button, share this with a friend who loves history, and subscribe for more forgotten stories from the ancient world. Who knows? The next great mystery we uncover might be even stranger. Thanks for watching.